It was the kind of trail that whispered promises of serenity, carved into the untouched wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Dense firs towered on either side, their needled canopies blocking out the sun so completely that even at midday, the path was dimly lit. Jacob and Melissa were experienced hikers seeking solace in nature after months of city life, but they would soon learn that some trails aren't meant to be walked. The first sign was the silence. At first, it seemed peaceful, a break from the cacophony of urban life. But as they ventured deeper, the absence of sound became unsettling. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of their boots on gravel and the occasional nervous laugh they shared. About 5 miles in, Melissa noticed something. "Jacob, stop," she whispered, gripping his arm. Ahead, partially obscured by undergrowth, was a tattered backpack. It looked as though it had been there for years, moss growing over the fabric, straps frayed and chewed. Curious, they approached. The contents were scattered: a rusted canteen, a faded map, and a journal. Melissa picked up the journal, thumbing through the pages. The entries were mundane at first. A man, likely solo, documenting his journey along the same trail. But the last few pages grew erratic. "I can hear it at night," one entry read. "A low, guttural sound, like a growl but deeper. It's following me. I know it is." The final entry was smeared and nearly illegible, but they made out one chilling phrase: "It won't let me leave." Jacob chuckled nervously. Probably just a prank someone left for gullible hikers. Melissa wasn't convinced. "It feels wrong, Jacob. We should turn back." Jacob insisted they press on. But as they continued, the air grew heavier, tinged with the faint, metallic scent of blood. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Shadows danced in their peripheral vision, but whenever they turned, nothing was there. By late afternoon, the unease had settled deep in their bones. They reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. Night came quickly, bringing with it a suffocating darkness. The fire they built barely seemed to penetrate the black void around them. As they ate in silence, they heard it, a distant, rhythmic thumping, like heavy footfalls on damp earth. Jacob rationalized it. "Probably a bear or a deer," he said, though his voice wavered. But then came the laughter. Not human, not animal, a distorted cackle that echoed from all directions. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle their campsite. Jacob grabbed a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness, but revealing nothing. "We're leaving," Melissa said, her voice trembling. They packed in record time, the oppressive sense of being watched never lifting. As they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trail markers they had followed so diligently on their way in were gone, replaced by strange carvings etched into the trees. Symbols they didn't recognize. Hours passed. The flashlight batteries began to fade. Exhausted and panicked, they stumbled into another clearing. But this one was wrong. It was the same clearing where they had camped. Their fire pit was still smoldering, their footprints circling the area. "We've been walking in circles," Melissa whispered, her voice breaking. And then they saw it. Just beyond the tree line, 2 pinpricks of light, like eyes reflecting the dying beam of their flashlight. They froze as the figure emerged, a towering silhouette, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and inhuman. The smell of decay hit them like a wave as the creature let out a sound, a guttural, bone-chilling growl that morphed into that horrible laughter. They ran. Adrenaline surged, their breaths ragged as they barreled through the forest, branches clawing at their skin. The laughter followed, relentless, echoing in their ears. Jacob tripped, slamming hard onto the ground. Melissa turned back to help him, but her scream was cut short as the creature loomed over them. The search party found their gear weeks later, scattered near the trailhead. Of Jacob and Melissa, no trace was ever discovered, save for a single page from the journal Melissa had picked up. It was pinned to a tree with a rusted knife, scrawled with a single word: "Stay."
Story number 2.
The rain started unexpectedly, a fine drizzle that slicked the rocky trail into something treacherous. Matt and Dana, seasoned hikers, were caught miles from civilization in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They knew the risks of hiking late in the season, but the promise of solitude in the crisp autumn air had been too tempting to resist. Now, as twilight approached and the rain intensified, they found themselves drenched and uneasy, the thick mist swallowing the world around them. Their map had promised a shelter further along the trail, but as darkness fell, their confidence wavered. The path grew narrower, the trees pressing in, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands. The only sounds were their labored breaths and the squelch of their boots in the mud. That's when they first saw it, a light in the distance. At first, they thought it was another hiker, someone who had beaten them to the shelter. Relieved, they quickened their pace, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The light didn't flicker or move, just hovered, unnaturally still. It wasn't the warm, yellow glow of a campfire, but a cold, bluish light that set Dana's teeth on edge. Matt hesitated, pulling out his flashlight and shining it toward the source. The beam cut through the mist, but it revealed nothing. "Maybe it's a reflection," he offered, though his voice carried doubt. "From what?" Dana whispered. They were miles from anything remotely man-made. The light disappeared. A heavy silence fell over them, broken only by the soft patter of rain. They exchanged a glance, a wordless agreement to keep moving. But as they continued, the light reappeared, this time closer. It was faint but insistent, bobbing just ahead of them, leading them off the main trail. "We shouldn't follow it," Dana said, her voice trembling. "This feels wrong." Matt nodded but hesitated. What if it's someone in trouble? Reluctantly, they veered toward the light. The forest thickened around them, the trees bending unnaturally as if trying to shield them from something. The light flickered, leading them to a clearing. The ground here was different, barren and blackened, as if scorched by fire. In the center stood a cabin, its walls sagging with age, its windows shattered. The light hovered near the doorway before vanishing altogether. "Let's go back," Dana said, grabbing Matt's arm. "We can't," Matt replied, gesturing to the trail behind them. It was gone, swallowed by the mist. They were trapped. The cabin was their only option for shelter. Against Dana's protests, Matt pushed open the creaking door. The interior was worse than they expected. The air was stale, thick with a metallic tang that made Dana gag. The floor was covered in dirt and something else. Bones, tiny ones like those of small animals or children. "This place is wrong," Dana whispered, backing toward the door. Matt froze, his flashlight beam fixed on the far wall. Words were scrawled there in a dark, sticky substance that could only be blood. They read, "Don't look behind you." Dana turned to run, but stopped cold. The doorway was no longer empty. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. It was human-shaped, but grotesquely wrong, its limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Its face was obscured by a burlap sack, but dark stains seeped through the fabric where its eyes should have been. Matt grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin. They scrambled through a shattered window, cutting themselves on the jagged glass. Outside, the mist had thickened into a choking fog. The forest was unrecognizable, the trees twisted and clawing at the sky. The laughter started then, low and guttural, echoing all around them. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something worse. They ran blindly, the laughter growing louder, more frantic. Shapes moved in the fog, glimpses of shadowy figures with impossibly long limbs and faces that seemed to shift and melt. Dana tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When Matt turned to help her, she screamed. One of the figures loomed over her, its head twitching violently as it reached out with claw-like hands. Matt yanked her up, and they bolted, adrenaline numbing their pain and exhaustion. They stumbled into another clearing, their lungs burning. In the center was the same cabin. The laughter stopped. The door creaked open. Inside, the blue light returned, hovering like a beckoning specter. The search party found only their packs days later, abandoned near the original trail. No sign of Matt or Dana was ever found. But hikers who've ventured into the area since have reported seeing a strange light in the mist and hearing laughter that doesn't belong.
Story number 3.
The Appalachian Trail is a place of beauty, stretching thousands of miles and attracting adventurers from all over the world. But seasoned hikers know that deep in its vast expanse, where the trees grow thick and the mountains block out the sun, there are places you shouldn't go. Lydia and Mark learned this the hard way. They were on the trail's lesser-used southern section, where the forest seemed untouched by time. Their goal was to camp for 2 nights before looping back to their car. The first day was perfect. Crisp air, golden leaves, and the sound of birdsong. By nightfall, they had set up camp by a bubbling creek, the fire crackling warmly as they shared stories and laughter. But as the fire died down, so did the natural sounds. It wasn't a gradual fade, but an abrupt and jarring silence. Lydia noticed it first. "Mark, do you hear that?" Mark tilted his head, frowning. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." They brushed it off as their imaginations, but sleep didn't come easy. The night felt heavy, as though the forest was watching. At some point, Lydia was jolted awake by a sound, a faint tapping like someone knocking gently on wood. She sat up, her heart racing, but the sound stopped. The next morning, they packed up and continued deeper into the woods. Mark tried to lighten the mood, joking about squirrels throwing acorns. But Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail markers grew scarce, and the map didn't match their surroundings. By midday, they realized they were lost. "We'll just backtrack," Mark said, trying to stay calm. But the path they had just taken was gone. The trees seemed to shift, closing in and creating new trails that led nowhere. The forest was unnaturally quiet again, except for the occasional tapping sound that seemed to follow them. By evening, they stumbled upon an old cabin nestled in a clearing. Its roof sagged and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Desperate for shelter, they decided to investigate. The inside was bare, save for a table and a single chair. The walls were covered in strange carvings, spirals, eyes, and other symbols neither of them recognized. Mark ran his fingers over one of the carvings. Someone really went all out with the creepy decor. "Let's just stay the night and leave first thing in the morning," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder now, echoing through the cabin. Mark shone his flashlight toward the door, but nothing was there. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. "Who's out there?" Mark shouted, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Then, from just outside the door, came a voice. It was soft, almost childlike, but wrong in a way Lydia couldn't describe. "Come out and play." Lydia clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Mark bolted the door, though it seemed like a flimsy defense. The voice came again, closer this time. "Don't you want to see me?" The air grew cold, and the tapping began again, this time at the windows. Shadows moved just beyond the glass, too tall and too thin to be human. Mark grabbed a knife from his pack, but his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Then came the laughter. High-pitched and echoing, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The door rattled violently, as though something massive was trying to force its way in. Mark and Lydia huddled together, paralyzed with fear. Just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again. They didn't dare move until the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. When they stepped outside, the clearing was empty, but the ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, elongated with claw-like toes. They didn't speak as they packed up and tried to find their way back. By sheer luck, they stumbled onto a main trail hours later. A passing hiker noticed their pale faces and frantic demeanor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the hiker joked. Mark grabbed the man's arm. "The cabin. Do you know about the cabin?" The hiker's smile faded. "You shouldn't have gone there. That place isn't on any map, and anyone who finds it usually doesn't come back." Lydia and Mark left the trail that day, vowing never to return. But at night, in the safety of their apartment, Lydia still hears the tapping, soft, persistent, and always coming from the window.
Story number 4.
The Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona are a wonderland of rugged beauty, known for their labyrinth of rock spires and dense, ancient forests. It was a place Danny and Chris had dreamed of exploring. Both amateur photographers, they hoped to capture the eerie beauty of the landscape during their weekend hike. What they captured instead was far worse. The trail they chose was remote, far from the popular routes. The ranger at the station had raised an eyebrow when they mentioned their plans. "Not many people go that way anymore," she said. "Hard to navigate and, well, there's the stories." Chris had laughed. "What kind of stories?" The ranger hesitated. "People getting turned around, hearing things, seeing things. Some folks think the land doesn't want them there." Danny, ever the skeptic, dismissed it. "Sounds like a great way to keep the tourists on the easy trails." The first day was uneventful. The trail wound through towering rock formations and narrow canyons. Danny and Chris stopped frequently to photograph the surreal landscape. By late afternoon, they found a spot to set up camp. The night sky was clear, the stars burning brightly above them. But as they sat by the fire, Danny noticed something strange. The wind had picked up, carrying a faint melodic sound. It wasn't birdsong or the rustle of leaves, it sounded like humming. A woman's voice, distant but distinct. "You hear that?" he asked. Chris nodded, his face pale. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The humming grew louder as the night wore on, punctuated by soft whispers they couldn't make out. Danny tried to laugh it off, but unease settled over them. They decided to sleep in shifts, though neither ended up getting much rest. The next day, they pressed on, hoping to shake the creeping dread. But the trail seemed to change beneath their feet. Landmarks they had passed earlier appeared in the wrong places, as though the landscape had shifted overnight. Danny checked the map and compass repeatedly, but nothing made sense. By mid-afternoon, they came upon something unexpected, a clearing with a small, dilapidated shack. It wasn't marked on the map. The wood was weathered and gray, the door slightly ajar. A faint smell of decay hung in the air. "Let's keep going," Chris said, his voice tight, but Danny, ever curious, stepped closer. "Just a quick look," he said, peering inside. The interior was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. On the floor was a circle of blackened stones, as though someone had once used it as a fire pit. The walls were covered in handprints, small, childlike, and smeared in what looked like dried blood. "Jesus," Danny whispered, backing out. They left quickly, the shack fading into the trees behind them. But the whispers started again, louder this time and closer. By dusk, they realized they were back at the clearing. The shack stood before them as if mocking their attempts to leave. Chris snapped. "We're leaving now. No more photos, no more exploring. We go back the way we came," but the forest seemed unwilling to let them go. The trail became a maze of dead ends and impassable thickets. Night fell, and they had no choice but to camp again. This time, the whispers didn't wait for nightfall. They surrounded the camp, joined by the soft crunch of footsteps circling just beyond the firelight. Chris clutched his knife, his knuckles white. "Who's there?" he shouted into the darkness. The footsteps stopped. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, or at least it had been once. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow pits that seemed to drink in the firelight. Her mouth hung open, and the humming spilled out, discordant and chilling. Danny scrambled for his camera, snapping a photo out of instinct. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, and they saw them, dozens of figures, standing just beyond the trees. They were all the same, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and humming. The fire sputtered out, plunging them into darkness. Danny and Chris ran blindly, the sounds of humming and whispers growing louder, more frantic. Branches clawed at their faces, roots tripped them, but they didn't stop. Somehow they burst onto a gravel road just as dawn broke. A passing trucker found them hours later, shaking and incoherent. They never spoke of the trip again, but Danny couldn't bring himself to delete the photos from his camera. One night, months later, he finally looked. Most were blurred, streaks of movement and chaos, but one photo was clear. It showed the clearing and the shack, surrounded by dozens of figures staring directly into the lens. Their eyes were black pits, and their mouths were twisted into silent screams. The humming started again that night, outside his apartment window.
Story number 5.
The boundary waters of northern Minnesota are known for their pristine lakes, dense forests, and miles of untouched wilderness. For Olivia, her brother Eric, and their two friends, Nate and Sarah, the isolation was part of the appeal. They planned a week-long canoe trip, eager to escape the pressures of work and city life. The first 3 days went smoothly. They paddled across glassy lakes, set up camp on rocky shores, and fell asleep to the gentle sounds of loons calling in the night. But on the 4th day, they decided to venture off the established routes. Nate had read about a hidden lake that few ever visited, a place not marked on most maps, but rumored to be accessible via a narrow, overgrown portage trail. The trail was hard to find and harder to follow. It wound through thick undergrowth and jagged rocks, with no clear markers. Their canoes scraped against fallen branches, and mosquitoes swarmed in the stagnant air. When they finally reached the lake, it wasn't what they expected. The water was black, still as glass, reflecting the twisted, ancient trees that crowded its edges. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. "Looks peaceful," Nate said, though his grin was forced. They paddled to a small island in the center of the lake to set up camp. The island was barren, save for a few stunted trees and moss-covered rocks. As they unloaded their gear, Sarah noticed something strange. A pile of stones, carefully arranged in a spiral near the water's edge. "Who do you think made this?" she asked. "Probably just another camper," Eric said, though his tone was uncertain. That night, they sat around a small fire, the lake's surface eerily still. The quiet was unnerving. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, there as though the air itself was swallowing sound. Then came the splashes. At first they thought it was a fish or a beaver, but the splashes grew louder, closer, and more deliberate. Something was moving in the water, circling the island. Olivia shone her flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the inky blackness. Probably just a deer swimming across, Eric said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the dark water. The splashing stopped. They laughed it off and retreated to their tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Olivia lay awake, listening. Hours later, she heard it, a low, mournful wail, like someone crying out in pain. It echoed across the lake, growing louder and more anguished. She shook Eric awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned but sat up, listening. The sound had stopped. The next morning, they found strange footprints in the damp soil near the fire pit. They weren't animal tracks, nor were they entirely human. They were long and narrow, with too many toes, and they led down to the water's edge. "We need to leave," Olivia said. Nate was reluctant. "It's just some prank. Maybe someone else is out here messing with us." But no one had seen another soul since they left the main routes. As they paddled back across the lake, the water seemed darker, almost as though something massive was moving beneath them. Halfway across, Olivia looked back toward the island and froze. A figure stood at the shore, tall and impossibly thin, its pale body stark against the shadowy trees, its head tilted unnaturally to the side as it watched them. "Paddle faster," she whispered. The others turned to look, and panic set in. They paddled furiously, but the figure didn't move. It only stared, its hollow eyes boring into them. That night, they camped on a familiar shore near the main trail. They didn't light a fire, too afraid to draw attention. But the sounds followed them, the wailing cries, the splashes, the faint sound of rocks clicking together. By dawn, they abandoned their plans and raced back to the entry point. When they reached the ranger station, the woman behind the desk noticed their pale faces and frantic demeanor. "You went to the Black Mirror Lake, didn't you?" she asked. Nate hesitated. "What's that supposed to mean?" The ranger sighed, her face grim. "That place isn't on any map for a reason. People go there and things happen. You're lucky you got out." "What's out there?" Olivia demanded. The ranger shook her head. "No one knows, but everyone who's seen it describes the same thing. Tall, pale, watching, and it doesn't like visitors." The group packed their gear and left without another word. None of them ever went camping again. But Olivia still dreams of the figure by the water, its hollow eyes staring Kihel, its thin arms slowly reaching out. And sometimes, late at night, she wakes to the sound of faint splashes outside her window.
Story number 6.
Nestled in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest was a trail known as Widow's Hollow, a name that alone kept many hikers away. The legend claimed it was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. Still, for thrill seekers like Alex and his girlfriend Rachel, it sounded like an exciting challenge. Both were experienced hikers and dismissed the stories as nothing more than old folklore. The trail was easy enough at first, winding through towering pines and thick ferns. The sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, casting the woods in a constant twilight. After several miles, they came across the ruins of an old cabin. Its rotting timbers leaned precariously, and the roof had long since caved in. What drew their attention, however, was the collection of small, crude wooden dolls hanging from the surrounding trees. Each one was bound with red twine and had a sharp stone driven into where its face should have been. Rachel shivered. "This is weird." "Probably someone's idea of a joke," Alex said, but his bravado faltered when he noticed how many there were. The dolls dangled from nearly every branch, swaying gently even though there was no breeze. "Let's keep going," Rachel said, her voice tight. They moved on, but the unsettling feeling lingered. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the forest became. No birds chirped, no animals scurried in the underbrush. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the dry leaves. By late afternoon, the trail began to disappear, swallowed by the forest. They checked the map, but it was no help. The landmarks didn't match. Alex tried to reassure Rachel, but his confidence wavered when they passed a tree with a fresh carving. A spiral, perfectly etched into the bark. They decided to turn back, but the path seemed different now. Trees they didn't recognize loomed where the trail should have been. Rachel insisted they had passed the same large rock twice. The forest was growing darker, and panic began to set in. Then they heard it, a faint sound like someone humming a lullaby. The melody was soft and slow, coming from somewhere just ahead. Rachel gripped Alex's arm. Do you hear that? Alex nodded, his face pale. Let's keep moving. Quickly. The humming grew louder as they walked, though there was no sign of anyone. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Rachel froze. Alex, look. A figure stood several yards away, partially hidden behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head was covered by something that looked like a burlap sack. 2 dark holes were cut where the eyes should have been, and it swayed slightly as if in time with the melody. Run, Alex whispered. They sprinted through the forest, no longer caring about the trail. Branches tore at their clothes and skin, but they didn't stop. The humming didn't fade, it followed them, growing louder, closer, almost in their ears. When they finally broke into a clearing, they stumbled and fell, gasping for air. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the figure emerged. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bending at wrong angles as it stepped closer. Rachel screamed, and Alex fumbled with his backpack, pulling out a small camping knife. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice was shaking. The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering him. Then it raised one long, claw-like hand and pointed to the ground. Alex followed its gesture and saw something half buried in the dirt. A wooden doll, bound with red twine, a stone embedded where its face should be. The figure took another step forward. Alex and Rachel didn't wait. They turned and ran again, the figure's movements quick and erratic as it followed. Just as Alex thought they would collapse from exhaustion, they burst onto a gravel road. A car's headlights blinded them, and the driver slammed on the brakes. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" the driver yelled. But Alex and Rachel couldn't answer. They turned back toward the forest. It was empty. No figure. No sound. They accepted a ride back to town and didn't speak the entire way. Days later, as Alex unpacked his gear, he found something he couldn't explain. Tucked into the side pocket of his backpack was a wooden doll, bound with red twine, and its face was shattered by a sharp stone. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the humming again. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside his window.
Story number 7.
Deep in the Ozark Mountains lies a trail known to locals as Devil's Ridge. It's not marked on any map, and even experienced hikers avoid it. But for Kayla, a journalist chasing the next big story, its sinister reputation was a challenge she couldn't resist. She convinced her friend Mason to join her, promising an unforgettable adventure. The entrance to the trail was hidden, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. The air felt heavier as they stepped into the dense canopy, the sunlight almost immediately swallowed by the trees. Kayla had read stories about Devil's Ridge, tales of ghostly sightings, strange disappearances, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Mason, though nervous, followed her lead. By mid-afternoon, they came across something strange. A small clearing with a ring of stones at its center. The ground inside the ring was scorched black, as though it had been burned recently. Around the perimeter were dozens of crude stick figures hanging from the trees like morbid decorations. Some had tufts of hair, feathers, or bits of cloth tied to them. Mason hesitated. "Kayla, maybe we should turn back." Kayla snapped a few photos, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "It's just someone's weird art project. Let's keep going." They pressed on, but the trail grew narrower and more overgrown. The further they went, the quieter the forest became. By dusk, they decided to set up camp near a small stream. As they ate their dinner, Mason noticed something unsettling. The forest, which had been silent all day, now seemed alive with faint whispers. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Kayla nodded, her bravado fading. The whispers were soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. They seemed to come from every direction surrounding the campsite. Mason shone his flashlight into the trees, but the beam revealed only twisted branches and shadows. "We should leave," he said. "It's too dark," Kayla replied, though her voice was shaky. "We'll go first thing in the morning." That night, neither of them slept. The whispers continued, growing louder at times before fading into an eerie stillness. At one point, Kayla thought she heard her name being called, faint and distant. Mason swore he saw movement just beyond the firelight, a tall, thin figure slipping between the trees. When dawn broke, they packed up in silence, eager to leave, but the trail they had followed the day before was gone. In its place was dense undergrowth, as if no one had ever walked there. They tried to retrace their steps, but every direction led them back to the same clearing with the ring of stones. Desperation set in. They decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead them to safety. Hours passed, but the landscape only grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the stream ahead of them. It was unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, and its face obscured by a tangle of black hair. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as though waiting. "Go back," Mason whispered, pulling Kayla behind him. The figure tilted its head, as if listening. Then, it raised one arm and pointed toward the forest. The whispers erupted into a cacophony, 100 voices all speaking at once. Kayla and Mason bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring where they ended up as long as it was away from that thing. When they finally broke free of the trees, they found themselves on the edge of a gravel road. A park ranger's truck was parked nearby. The ranger, a grizzled man with a weathered face, looked at them in surprise. "You two shouldn't be out here," he said. "What trail were you on?" "Devil's Ridge," Kayla gasped. The ranger's face darkened. "That's not a trail. It hasn't been for decades." "What do you mean?" Mason asked. The ranger sighed. "Back in the 70s, there were a series of disappearances out there. People said the woods were cursed. After the last group vanished, they closed it off for good. Whatever's out there, it doesn't want visitors." Kayla and Mason didn't argue. They got in their car and drove away, leaving their gear behind. But the experience stayed with them. Kayla deleted the photos she had taken, unable to bear looking at them. Mason stopped hiking altogether. Months later, Kayla received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, one she hadn't taken. It showed the clearing with the ring of stones, but this time, the tall figure stood in the center, its face turned toward the camera. In its hand was one of the stick figures, bound with red twine and dripping with something dark. That night, Kayla swore she heard her name whispered from the shadows outside her window.